Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Italian Campaign. My guest this week is Sir Nick Young, Chair of the San Martino Trust, who will talk about the Trust and the inspiration he draws from his father's experiences in Italy in the Second World War. Following the failure of the second attempt to break the German defences on the Monte Cassino Massif and at Cassino itself, Fifth Army Commander General Mark Clark on the 20th of February ordered a fresh approach to breaching the Gustav Line. This would entail the French Expeditionary Corps holding its positions north of Cassino and taking over Monte Castellone from the Americans. 10 Corps was to regroup and put pressure on the front from Minturno to San Giorgio. 2 Corps was to withdraw into reserve. The New Zealand Corps, now comprising the 2nd New Zealand Division, 4 Indian Division and Britain's 78th Division, was given the task of taking Monte Cassino and crossing the Rapido into the Liri Valley. As part of the new plan, it was decided that the town of Cassino itself was to be heavily bombed to destroy German defences before the New Zealand attack. This was planned to start on the 24th of February, but was postponed due to bad weather, which prevented air operations. On that day, New Zealand Corps Commander General Bernard Freyberg visited General Clark and called for more air cover. Clark recorded his feelings in his diary. "The more I see of Freyberg, the more disgusted I am with his actions. He may be an extremely courageous individual, but he has no brains, has been spoiled, demands everything in sight, and altogether is most difficult to handle." 2 days later, Clark expressed his frustrations again, this time about the support 6th Corps was getting at Anzio from Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, Admiral John Cunningham. Evidence continues to accumulate that Admiral Cunningham and his Navy are in no way cooperating with me. He imposes so many restrictions and makes it so difficult that it is easier in most cases to do without his naval gunfire support than to accept the restrictions he imposes. With reference to supplies, he has set an arbitrary limit of 2,500 tons per day, which not only is not sufficient to maintain my forces, but thereby precludes the essential build-up for any counter-offensive. There was soon better news for Clark. On the 29th of February, he was told that he had been relieved of command of the 7th Army, which was being prepared for Operation Anvil, the invasion of southern France. Bad weather, including heavy rain, led to further postponements of the New Zealand Corps' attack. There were changes on both sides of the front line. By the start of March, the Germans had more than 5 divisions along the southern front, with 1 complete division and part of another in the reserve. 8th Panzer Grenadier Regiment rejoined 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division at the Anzio beachhead. 94 Grenadier Division held the southern sector of the Gustav Line from the sea to Azente Creek. On its left, 71 Grenadier Division took over the Castelforte area by the 7th of March, and elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division were to the north as far as St. Ambrogio. From that point to Cassino, the line was held by the 3rd Battalion of 104 Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Cassino and the surrounding hills to Monte Caro were garrisoned by the elite 1st Parachute Division. The 3rd Parachute Regiment was in Cassino, 4th Parachute Regiment was in the hills north and west of the town, and 1st Parachute Regiment was on the south slope of Monte Caro. Elements of the 44th Grenadier Division filled the gap from Monte Caro to north of Tirele. The line from that point northeast was held by the 5th Mountain Division. 90th Panzer Grenadier Division was placed in reserve at Frosinone, 35 miles up the Liri Valley. The 1st Battalion of the 3rd Parachute Regiment was on Monastery Hill and Castle Hill and on Point 236. The 2nd Battalion was in Cassino with 3 companies of the 3rd Battalion attached. Elsewhere, America's 88th Infantry Division replaced the 5th Division along the Garigliano River on the 5th of March. An advanced element of America's 85th Division went into the line on the river near Monturno on the 28th of March. The 88th and the 85th were the first US divisions, composed almost entirely of draftees, to enter combat. In the Cassino area, 11th Brigade of 78th Division was deployed on the Gari south of Cassino on the 23rd of February and was joined 3 days later by 36th Brigade. This allowed formations of the New Zealand Division to be transferred to take over some of the positions along the Rapido Valley held by the Americans. On the 2nd of March, New Zealand Division Commander General Howard Kippenberger climbed Monte Trocchio and slipped on a mine. 1 foot was severed, and the other foot and the lower portions of both legs were subsequently amputated. He was replaced by Temporary Major General Graham Parkinson, previously commander of the New Zealand 6th Brigade. On the 9th of March, Royal Irish Fusiliers Captain Laurie Franklin Vale wrote from Capua to his wife Olive in the UK. Dearest Olive, 9 years ago today we were married, and what a lot has happened since then. I think this is only the 2nd time that we have spent our wedding anniversary apart, the other being in 1940 when I was at the Infantry Training Centre in Bedford. I certainly hope that next year we will be together again. Well, we've had some fine times together, and I am certain we will have many more in the future. Barossa Day was quite a big success. The officers and sergeants football match was quite a hilarious affair and about the best ever. It was contested on a field about 1 inch deep in water, and we were certainly a sight at the end. A good dinner was provided for the men, and in the evening we had our own dinner at a hall in a nearby town. Quite a good meal was provided with the usual Barossa customs, with a speech by the junior subaltern, young Hanson, and the passing of the Barossa drinking cup. Afterwards, the sergeants arrived, and the evening assumed a fairly hectic note and ended up in some fierce scrums and a few thick heads the following morning. I am now joined by Sir Nick Young, who is chair of the Monte San Martino Trust, to talk about the work of the Trust and the inspiration that he's drawn from his father's experiences in Italy in the Second World War. Hello, Nick. Lovely to see you. You're in Suffolk, I believe.
I am, yes. It's pretty wet up here.
Yes, well, it's nice in London. Anyway, so let's get into it. And I wanted this episode to really focus on the work of the Monte San Martino Trust. And we'll talk about it at the end of our conversation. But the Monte San Martino Trust is born out of the experiences of men like your father. He was an officer in the British Army. So tell us about your father, Leslie Young, and we'll take the journey up until that moment when he comes to Italy and the adventures he had there. So first of all, he was born in March 2011, wasn't he? So
yes, he was, and he had a pretty sort of average school career. He ended up at a public school called Ardingly in Sussex, where he became very involved in the corps, in the cadet corps, and immediately after he left school, he joined up to the reserve of officers. So he was in pretty regular training right the way through the 30s until 1939, when war was declared, and he was immediately in and joined the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment.
Because he was born in Cheam, though, so Bedford and Hertfordshire is not in Cheam. How did he get in the Bed and Herts?
That was because his brother, Alan Young, known as Porky Young, as was my father, had lived in Bedfordshire. He was a bit older than Dad, and he had joined the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment. So I think it was fairly natural that Dad would join the same regiment.
Yes, interesting. This is an example of someone who was a reserve officer, a territorial officer, who was immediately converted into a full-time serving officer as soon as the war started. So the first adventure for your father was 1940, when he was sent to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. What happened to him there?
The phony war, really, and he spent a few months in France stooging around and digging trenches, and looking at the Maginot Line. They took their place in the Maginot Line for a couple of months. And yes, he was basically in training and getting ready for whatever the war threw at him. And then, as we all know, the Germans came marching through the Low Countries and into France. And all of a sudden it was all over. And these young soldiers in the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment, all sort of spoiling for a fight, as were so many others, suddenly found themselves in headlong retreat back towards Dunkirk. And that was a terrible shock for them. And although my father really never talked about it, I discussed it with several people who had fought with him. And I think they were all just traumatized by this extraordinary headlong rush back to the coast. And of course, as we know, the situation at Dunkirk was absolutely dire. And I think that was, I wrote a book about my father's experiences. And that was the most difficult part of the book, was finding out, first of all, researching the grim horror that was the beaches at Dunkirk, far removed from some of the romantic films we've seen in recent times. And then imagining my father right in the middle of that. He obviously spent a lot of time trudging along beaches and was eventually directed with the remains of his regiment to the East Mole at Dunkirk. And that was where he embarked on one of the last boats out of Dunkirk. Amazing that he or any of them survived it, physically or mentally. Actually, it must have been a really traumatizing experience. Found himself back in Blighty, and wasn't excited by the thought of months of training waiting for the chance to strike back at the Germans. So he immediately signed up for the new commando force, which was literally just being established at that time. He was one of the first volunteers.
Yes, he joined the 4 Commando, didn't he? And it's an interesting story, because if you've read Evelyn Waugh's Sword of Honor, the way that people got into the commandos at this point was all rather arbitrary and haphazard.
Completely. I mean, he became troop commander. He was given complete freedom to recruit his own troop. He had a wall of death rider, a couple of poachers, the most extraordinary mix of people. And they all ended up with 4 Commando in Weymouth, training for beach landings as commandos. And there's a wonderful story that the king came down to inspect them and was standing on the pier at Weymouth, whilst 4 Commando swam in front of him, saluting in full kit. I don't know whether that's true, but it was a great story. They then went up to Inverarlet in Scotland for some more commando training, where they met the famous duo Fairbairn and Sykes. And no doubt Dad learned how to kill people silently and in various violent ways, which he never explained to me, sadly. That would have been fun, I'm sure, as a young kid, to have learnt about the commando dagger and its uses. And then in January 1940, he found himself on what was actually the first commando raid of the war, which was the war on the Lofoten Islands off the northwest coast of Norway, right up in the Arctic Circle, which, along with the rest of Germany, had been occupied by the Germans. And the importance of the Lofoten Islands was the manufacture of fish oil. As I'm sure you know, Norway in those days was an awful lot about fish, and the cod oil was used to lubricate German armaments, but also in the manufacture of nitroglycerin. So Churchill had decided, as his first sort of big commando strike of the war, to wipe out these fish oil factories and capture as many Germans as possible. So they set off in 3 destroyers across the North Sea, led by a submarine, anchored off the coast of the Lofoten Islands in the early morning in, I think it was February 1940. And 1941 we must be in now, 1941. And they landed on shore. There was almost no resistance. The Germans were taken completely by surprise. They were immediately besieged by the Norwegians, absolutely delighted to see the Brits on shore. All the schnapps came out, and a lot of drinking was done, and coffee was drinking, and backs were slapped. And then they set about blowing up these fish oil factories. I'm sure that was great fun for them, really. And very few shots were fired. They did find an Enigma machine in one of the villages they attacked, which was quite a first actually, and returned back to the UK after a pretty exciting morning with 200 or more German prisoners, another couple of hundred of Norwegian volunteers for the Norwegian forces that were then based in London, and a successful kind of publicity really for the commandos, and a chance for the Churchill and the Brits to show that they were fighting back against the German occupation of Europe.
Yes, and then I mean, your father was an athlete, wasn't he? He was exceptionally fit. He was.
He was. Well, I talked to somebody who had fought with him in the commandos, who said, "Oh yeah, your old dad, he was a real fitness fanatic. We called him the Mad Major. He never led anybody across a bridge if he could possibly make them swim the river."
Yeah, and he's significantly over 6 foot tall, so a splendid specimen and fitted very well. But then he left the commandos. I think kind of reluctantly, didn't he?
He did. He didn't want to go, but he really didn't like his commanding officer at the time, and he felt that, you know, the raid had been, in a way, a bit of a damp squib for the men themselves. And the talk was that there wasn't going to be another raid for some time, and that they'd be doing a lot more training. Well, he'd already done months of training. So, and he got word that his regiment, the Beds and Hearts Regiment, was heading to North Africa. So he decided to rejoin his regiment as became adjutant, and ready to go abroad and fight whenever he got the chance.
Okay, well, so that takes us to the next dramatic chapter, which is eventually in March 1943.
Yes, he had a long wait back in Bedford as well.
He landed in Algiers with the Bedfordshire Hearts, I think 10th Battalion, I think Bedfordshire Hearts and 43, and that took him to the Tunisian front line. So, but he was there not much more than a month when he was involved in his first battle. And what happened then?
Well, he was tasked, his company was tasked with taking a ridge that was held by a crack German division, which he did. He did, despite the fact that the radios didn't work. There weren't enough. They didn't have enough ammunition. They had to ration ammunition, but they took this ridge as required and held it overnight. But the Germans re-attacked early the next morning in force. And after quite a fierce fight, when Dad lost a lot of his men, he was forced to surrender. And I have absolutely no doubt that must have tormented, well, I know that tormented my father for the rest of his life, because years later I found some correspondence dated just a couple of years before he died, when he'd met up with his second in command at a regimental reunion. And he had clearly asked his friend what people thought about what happened that day in Tunisia. Clearly worried that it was felt that, you know, he should have fought to the last man, including himself, and clearly worried that he had missed the opportunity to keep the Germans off that ridge. And the second in command reassured him and said, "Look, Leslie, there's absolutely no way you could have held that ridge. Everybody knows it's impossible to fight a razor edge ridge. And you did everything you possibly could." And when I went to see this guy, Tom LaFontaine, who became quite a well-known artist, he said, "Look, your dad was just one of the finest officers I ever worked with, and he had absolutely nothing to reproach himself with." But that wouldn't have been good enough for Dad. I think he'd have felt that.
No, this
defeat bitterly.
Yes, because he was a serious soldier, not professional, but took it all very seriously. He was a major, and he was in command of a company. Terrible blow to lose your company and to be taken prisoner as well.
And I've followed my father's footsteps throughout most of his wartime journeys, and I've managed to find, with a Tunisian guide, I managed to find the very hill that he attacked and defended. I mean, it was just bare rock. There was nothing there. There was no protection at all. They had no chance of fighting back, I think, against this crack German brigade.
No,
And
my father was in Trinity at the same time, and he was in
Oh.
roughly the same area. So he was fighting with the 78th Division, and they were on the north of the river valley above Manchester.
Yeah.
And we've been there as well, and it's it's free of cover and it's rocky, but he saw he got through. Anyway, so this brings through to your father's next moment, which is that he was taken prisoner. He was treated as a prisoner of the Italians, even though he was taken prisoner by the Germans, but he was treated as a prisoner of the Italians. So he was transported with others all the way up to the north of Italy to a place called Fontanallato near Parma in northern Italy, where he was placed in a prisoner of war camp, an Italian prisoner of war camp handled by Italians. So tell us briefly about his experiences there.
Well, like most people who were captured in North Africa, he ended up in a prison camp in Italy. This particular camp, Fontanallato, was his second camp. He started off a bit further south at Capua. But the Fontanallato camp was a model camp, really. It was 500 officers and 100 other ranks who were effectively acted as batmen and servants and ran the sort of catering side of the camp and looked after the officers. It was a model camp. I think it was actually set up probably to deceive the Red Cross, who were at that time inspecting POW camps. And it was quite comfortable. I mean, they lived... They had the officers were in really quite spacious rooms, 4 or 5 to a room mostly. The food wasn't bad. They were getting their Red Cross food parcels. They even had a bar with a ration of martini and beer and wine every day if they wanted it. And I think it was a good camp. Eric Newby, the famous travel writer, was a POW there, and he had a great time gambling in the basement. In fact, they used to gamble all over the camp. They had particular fun gambling on a game of poo sticks on a little stream that ran through the camp. So that was where he was in September 1943, when the Italians laid down their arms and signed up to the armistice. And there was great rejoicing in the camp. Everybody was just thrilled. The Italians all threw their hats in the air and dumped their rifles and headed off for home. The camp commandant, a guy called Vice Domini, though, was concerned that very quickly the British officers in the camp would be captured by the Germans. And this led to an interesting discussion between him and Lieutenant Colonel Hugo de Burgh, who was the senior British officer, because de Burgh had been instructed, along with the senior British officer in every other POW camp in Italy, there were about 80 of them. They'd all been instructed from London to stay put. The story was that Monte didn't want thousands, tens of thousands of British POWs running around on the loose in Italy and just getting in the way and causing trouble. So the order came, stay put, we're on our way up from the south and we'll very quickly liberate you. Well, de Burgh, along with a few other senior British officers in other camps, came to the conclusion that this order was ridiculous, that the Germans would come down from the north and very quickly overrun Italy. And if they all stayed in the camp, they would be taken prisoner and carted off to Germany. And indeed, that's what happened a couple of days later at Fontanallato. But in the meantime, Vice Domini had cut a hole in the wire, and the 500 British officers marched out in formation into the Italian countryside nearby, where they hid out in a dried up stream bed for a couple of days, trying to work out what to do. And nobody really had a clue. The local Italians were very generous with food, and they gave them Italian clothing so that these fairly beefy British officers could try and disguise themselves as Italian peasants. Not easily done. They just didn't know. Should they go north and try and get into Switzerland across the Alps, or should they go to one of the coasts and try and get on some sort of boat? Or should they head south towards the invading Allied forces, which were making already a very slow and painful way up from the boot of Italy?
So
that, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So that brings. I'm going to just add some pictures now to the screen. See if I can make this work. No, that didn't work. Let's see. So here we are. We have a photograph on the looking at it on your right is your book, Escape with His Life from Dunkirk to D-Day and Beyond, by you, about your father. And there's your father as an officer, and that's on the left of the photograph of your father, not long before he passed away. So let me just move on to another slide. And that shows you roughly where Fontaneletto is. So it's up in the north, it's in the Po Valley, with Milan and Verona quite close by. But then the journey started. They escaped from the camp. Your father and 2 other men headed south. And I've just put out a few places in this map. So you can see Fontaneletto. And then he walked basically through the mountains to Sigillo, Cavaro, and then down to Latina, and eventually into Anzio. That's the route, about 500 kilometers. So tell us about that journey. And it, in total, I mean, it was more than 4 months on the run. But the issue, of course, was that no, they were in a hostile country. It was German-occupied territory. The Germans had threatened anybody who helped the Italians with severe reprisals, including death, confiscation of property, deportation. Tell us about the journey. I mean, it's an incredible epic story.
Yes, it is.
So tell us about the highlights of the story, and take us to the journey to Cavaro, which is a bit of a turning point.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, it was an epic journey. He started out with dressed as an Italian peasant. I mean, my father was over 6 foot tall. He had a moustache. I mean, he looked nothing like an Italian peasant. He sounded nothing like an Italian peasant. He must have stuck out like a sore thumb. And indeed, all of the escaping prisoners from that camp and the other camps who had taken this line of not staying put, they all stuck out like sore thumbs in the Italian countryside. They decided to start with to walk at night and to head for the hills, to head up into the Apennine Mountains, which is it's called the spine of Italy. It's a chain of very high mountains that runs right the way down the Italian peninsula. And yeah, I mean, that first night they walked, him and an RAF guy. They walked about 10 miles that first night to a tiny little village, about 6 houses. I've been there. They walked down through from the sort of the forest down into the village. Silent. It was dusk, and they had to try and find a place to stay. They had to work out, well, where would be safe? What kind of Italian would take pity on them and take them in, maybe give them some food, let them sleep in a barn and whatever. And in the 48 little hamlets in the Apennine Mountains that my father stayed in, they had that dilemma every single night, who to trust. And they would always go to the poorest looking house around, the farm with the fewest haystacks, the poorest looking dwelling. These were mostly sharecropper farmers, so they had absolutely nothing, these people. And yet my father's experience, all bar one night, all the way through that journey, which lasted from the middle of September right the way through until, November, when he got to Cavaro. His experience was that they were taken in, they were fed, they were slept in a barn, sometimes even in a bed. They were given maps, they were given food, and they were sent on their way by families who literally risked their lives to protect them. There was a price on these prisoners' heads. The Italian peasant farmers who helped them were sure of severe reprisals, often death of the whole family, sometimes death of a whole village or all the men in a village for helping Allied escapers, of whom there were by this stage quite a few thousand dotted around Italy.
Well, you can see
a hair-raising journey. as time went on, there were Germans everywhere. There were regular, what they call rastrellamentos, or rakings, to sort of shake the trees in a local village and see who was hiding who. There were fascist supporters and spies everywhere. It was constant danger, both for the escapers and for all these amazing Italian families who helped them.
Well, you can see, I put the photograph, can you see that, of two gentlemen who were your father's companions? Just talk briefly about both of them.
So the guy on the left, Reg, he is the RAF man. He spoke a bit of Italian, and he was very good with the ladies. They would quite often, in these little barns where they were, they would be visited by the local girls, intrigued at the sight of, two British soldiers. So Reg was very good with them. And in fact, he eventually decided not to move further south with my father. Dad just wanted to get back to Britain and back into the war. Reg, I think, was a bit happier just to, he was given a home in an Italian family for several weeks. And he was very happy there. Meanwhile, my father, who spent a couple of nights with a bunch of partisans, a fairly bloodthirsty lot, he met up with the guy on the right, a New Zealander called Charlie Gatenby. And Charlie was much more like my father. He just wanted to get on with the war. And so the two of them ended up trekking down the rest of the journey to this little town called Corvaro, which is about 70 miles northeast of Rome. And they got to Corvaro and they went into a little shop and got talking to that. There we are. This is the De Michaelis family, Pepe and Bernardina De Michaelis. I'm part of their family. I met their son, who remembered my father. In fact, he remembered sitting on my father's knee during an Allied air raid on the town because there was a German garrison there. And I'm great friends now with their grandchildren. We try and visit every year. Wonderful, wonderful couple, these two, because the Gatenby and my father were in a bad state by this time. I mean, they'd been living rough for months. Dad had developed pneumonia, and early November it started snowing. And that winter of 1943-44 was a particularly bad one. There was 7 or 8 feet of snow on the ground. So these two people, they hid them in the basement to start with, and I've been into that basement and hidden where they used to hide if the Germans came calling. And then they took them up into a little sort of shepherd's hut, which they owned, the Casale it was called, right up in the mountains, where my father and Gatenby and eventually a couple of other POWs hid out for the winter. And I mean, it was absolutely perishing cold. And I feel certain those guys would have died of exposure had it not been for Pepe here, who every other day would trek up to this Casale with a horse and cart and hot food and hot drink just to keep them alive under the noses of the German garrison. I mean, it was incredibly brave. And this went on for weeks. Dad recovered from his pneumonia. And yes, it was in Corvaro and in this Casale that they met up with 2 very special young Jewish Italians. Here they are. That's Eugenio on the left and his sister Silvia Elfa. Eugenio was 23. He was known as Doc because he'd been to university, so he was bright. And Silvia on the right, it was only 19. And these 2 brave young people, they'd been part of the sort of golden generation in Rome. Their father was a fur trader. They were quite well to do. They lived a life of skiing in the mountains in the winter and sunning themselves on the beaches at Anzio in the summer. But they very quickly joined the partisans. I mean, so these were Jewish people. So they'd be back pretty poorly treated under the Mussolini era, but by no means as badly as Jewish people in further north in Europe and Germany. But nevertheless, it was a tough life. And when the Germans invaded, they very quickly, the whole family decamped to the mountains around Corvaro. These 2 joined a local partisan band, and they made it their business of trying to help escapers in whichever way they could. We're talking now middle of January 1944, and they had heard talk about an invasion, Allied invasion at Anzio. And they offered to guide my father and Charlie Gatenby, the New Zealander, to Anzio, which was about 5 days of pretty hard walking through the mountains in the snow, so that Dad and Charlie could join up with the Allied forces. It was a really tough journey. They had to sleep in caves or even out in the rough. There was no cover. There were Germans everywhere because, of course, as we know, the Allies did indeed invade and attack Anzio, landed on the beach in force. And the Germans were very, very prompt at rushing troops down to mount a very strong counterattack. And, eventually they did arrive at a place called Norma on a cliff overlooking the Pontine marshes, which then, with Anzio in the distance, I suppose about 3 or 4 miles away.
So they got rough. They penetrated all the way down to the southeast of Anzio. If you look at the map, closer to the biggest town, Latina.
Yes, near Latina.
So they decided they were going to try and infiltrate. And how many people were in the group at this time? There was
well, there was my father and Gatenby. There was Eugenio and Sylvia, and Sylvia's boyfriend, a guy called Corvino. He was an interesting guy. He was the son of a very well-known fascist sympathizer in Rome. And certainly the Elfa parents were extremely worried about Sylvia's friendship with this man. They rather feared that he might be, literally an agent trying to track down escaping Jews. And they were very worried for the safety of the whole family. But I think these two were in love. And so the three of them set out to guide Charlie and Leslie to Anzio. There was a feeling that I think Gatenby felt that Corvino was quite keen to escape from Italy altogether and somehow to be helped by the Americans and the Brits at Anzio. But it's all a bit vague, that part of the story, and I haven't been able to track down very much of it, although I have met his son in Rome, which was an extraordinary experience. An absolutely lovely guy, got on very well with him. But yeah, so they set out to literally infiltrate, to find their way through the German line and through the German minefields. Already the Germans had laid extensive minefields.
So they set out, I think, on the 4th, and so it was on the 5th of February 1944 at night, and they were penetrating. They got through. They were trying to get through the German line, and what happened there is a terrible climax.
Yeah, they got through the German line, and they then crawled on hands and knees, each person holding the ankle of the person in front, to get through the German minefields. And they were spotted by a German patrol, which opened fire. The German patrol, Eugenio just disappeared. I mean, nobody knew what happened to Eugenio. And Corvino was hit in the chest, and Charlie investigated and decided that Corvino was dead too. And Sylvia was distraught. She desperately wanted to stay with her boyfriend, his body, and with Eugenio, who had also presumably been killed. But my father and Charlie both persuaded her that actually that meant certain death for the three of them, and that their only chance of surviving at all was to carry on through no man's land and to get to the American lines, which were only by this stage, only about a mile and a half away. So eventually Sylvia was persuaded to do this. The German patrol had sort of disappeared, and they set off again, by this time crawling the whole time on hands and knees. And within sight of the American lines, an American patrol from the Devil's Brigade opened fire. Charlie was hit in the shoulder and sort of fell into a ditch. Dad went left into another ditch, and Sylvia was hit in the throat. Eventually, my father was able to yell enough at the Americans to persuade them to stop firing. And he picked up Sylvia's body and carried her to the American Jeep. And they very quickly transported her to the field hospital at Anzio, where she died early the next morning.
It was a terrible story. Two young people
Mm.
with their whole lives in front of them, caught up in this terrible war because they were Jewish, and they were obviously threatened because the deportations under the Nazis had been taking place from Rome. They would have been targeted there. And so there they were, helping your father and his companion, and both of them died, both of them killed, trying to get into Anzio. Your father and Charlie survived. So what was tell us a story about what happened to the Alpha family after that.
Well, so about 2 months after he heard that his children were dead, Antonio Alpha, the father, died of a heart attack. He was just distraught at what happened. His wife, Lisa, lived on. And at the end of the war in 1946, she journeyed to Anzio and managed to find her daughter's body, Sylvia's body, in the American War Cemetery at Nettuno. And she got permission to exhume the body and take it back with her to Rome to be buried in the Jewish section of the Verano Cemetery in the capital. And one of the little bits of paper that was a clue to this amongst my father's papers was a little paperclip that from a Rome newspaper referring to the burial of this body in Verano. Nothing more was heard about Corvino and nor Eugenio. But then one day a friend who lived in Latina spotted a clipping in a local newspaper about a body that had been found in a ditch not far away. And she wrote to Lisa about this body. And Lisa decided to investigate. She sent a telegram to my father, with whom she was in touch, and Dad had sent them money and, tried to console her about the death of her children. And she asked Leslie, my dad, what was Eugenio wearing on the day he died, and was he carrying any papers? And Dad was able to give her this information, and armed with it, she went down to Latina. She had the body. She went to the local morgue where the body was still being stored, and she was able to identify the body as her son's. I mean, this is 1947. This is 2 years after the end of the war. Longer than that, 1944, the boy died. So 3 years after the boy had died, she found the body and brought it back to Rome to be buried with his father, Antonio, and with his sister, Sylvia. And every week, Lisa used to visit the body. She lived on to be 105 years old, quite extraordinary, never remarried, but spent her time doing a bit of teaching and mourning the death of her beloved family. She was eventually buried with them in 1995. And I visited the grave with my wife several times. It's always, it's just an extraordinary experience to sit by the grave of two people who helped your father live. In fact, I'm quite sure Dad would have been dead if it had not been for those two people. He never spoke about them. I don't think he could bear to even think about them, to be honest with you. I can't imagine how he must have felt about this.
And for people who go to Rome and go into this cemetery, take the opportunity to pay respects to the Alpha family, the father and the mother and the children. What an incredible sacrifice for the cause of liberty, for the people of Italy, for the Jewish community of Italy and the world. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And if there is an upside to this, Nick, is that you've got the story and you've been sharing it. So that is absolutely wonderful. Now, let's move on, because I know your father, as if your father didn't have enough, he went back to the UK, volunteered, served in the Queen's Brigade as a company commander then, and was involved in the liberation of Northwest Europe. I'm not going to go into that.
That's another story.
It's another story. But needless to say, he was a casualty, wasn't he?
He was wounded. His company HQ was attacked in eastern France on the way through to the Low Countries. It was extraordinary. A drunk Hitler Youth Brigade suddenly attacked them from a band of trees. And Dad was wounded. He refused to go off to hospital. He insisted on staying on with his men. and he fought his way all the way through the Low Countries, the northern route. I mean, it was a tough route. A lot of people call that a fight through, that journey through from Normandy to the German border, the Great Swan. It certainly wasn't a swan for my father. He was fighting a tough bunch of Germans who turned and fought at every opportunity. But they eventually got through to the German border. So many people had died in his brigade, that his battalion, that it was merged with another battalion. And because my father had been in from the start and was felt that he'd done enough, he was sent home with other sort of long-time soldiers. And it must have been an extraordinary moment when they set off back for Britain again. I would imagine my father was quite cross, actually. I think he would probably have liked to get through to Berlin, but he didn't quite get there.
So the war ended, your father in the UK, that he left the army and got married and went back to work in his family firm, where he continued and keeping a lot of this story to himself, and only, as you detail in your book, after he passed on, that you were going through.
As I say, Eddie, he hardly mentioned it at all. I mean, we vaguely knew about Italy, we vaguely knew about Dunkirk, but not much else. Or vaguely knew about the commandos, but he'd never wanted to talk. He never boasted. And it wasn't until literally 2 days after his death, when I was clearing out his bedside cabinet, that I found a little notebook. And this notebook turned out to be a diary that he kept in the prison camp and while he was on the run. There were no names in it. There was no geography. There were no people listed, obviously, because he would have feared that if he'd been picked up by the Germans, he'd have given them all away. But I was able to piece together enough to work out it had been a prison camp in Italy. And I found eventually, with his army papers, a list of what turned out to be small hamlets in Italy that he had obviously stayed in. And I've visited every single one of those hamlets now and left a little note of thanks from our family for what they did for Dad.
It is really extraordinary. And I do, again, recommend the book to get. I mean, it's so rich about this story and an epic. Now we come on to the legacy. So the Monte San Martino Trust, and this is an image showing two young people. They could well be Sylvia and Eugenio and the Allied troops in the painting. The Monte San Martino Trust was established. Now you chair it now, but this organization was functioning already, and then you got involved in it a little bit later. Tell us about the origins of the Monte San Martino Trust, what it's doing now, what it's going to do in the future.
It was set up in 1989 by an extraordinary man called Keith Kilby, who had been a conscientious objector, actually, but he decided that he couldn't, in all honour, pursue his objection to war whilst others were dying for his freedom. So he signed up as a medical orderly. He ended up being drafted into the SAS, and he went with them on several raids. And it was actually a raid in Sardinia that he was eventually captured. And he ended up in a prison camp in Italy as well. And he escaped. And he was helped, like my father, by amazing numbers of Italian peasant farmers in the Apennine Mountains. So after he retired in 1989 from his meat business in Smithfield Market in London, he decided to find a way of saying thank you to these Italians who'd helped him and so many other escapers. And he decided to set up a little trust and to use his own money to fund the activities of the trust, which were to bring young Italians from the families and from the villages where they had helped escapers over to Britain for a month in the summer to learn some English. And it was just a small way of saying thank you. Other ex-POWs flocked to the cause. They started meeting annually in a little Italian restaurant in the Haymarket and just remembering. And they also started to put together an extraordinary collection of escape stories and accounts, both published and unpublished. And so the activities of the trust were really twofold. One was bringing 20 or 30 Italians to Britain each year to learn some Italian, and secondly, to host this extraordinary collection of escape stories from what I always think of as the greatest escape in the war. I mean, something like 50,000 POWs in Italy went on the run after the armistice. And although most of them were picked up, I mean, and ended up in Germany or dead, about 10 or 11,000 got back to Britain. My dad was one of them. And so were several of these POWs who helped with the Monte San Martino Trust. I became, there was a period, and then Keith was running the thing, and then a guy called Brian Lett chaired it. He stood down, and I took over from him in the early 2000s. And we have now extended the activities of the Trust. We now getting on for 40 students each year, still from the areas where they helped escapers, and often from people from actual families who helped escapers. We've extended the collection of escape accounts, and we've now digitized all of those. They're all available on our website, and we're just about to hand over the original documents, I mean, this priceless archive of documents, to the Cambridge University Library. And Cambridge University, the Italian department, is going to be launching a major PhD research project into this extraordinary story from the Second World War. We've also had an extraordinary and amazing discovery. At the end of the war, the Allies set up something called the Allied Screening Commission, which was established to try and find a way of compensating Italian families who had helped escapers and who had suffered losses in the process. I mean, the Elfers are a typical example. And so Italians who had helped escapers were invited to submit compensation claims to the Allied Screening Commission. And eventually they amassed an extraordinary collection of files. I mean, something like 60,000 files of Italian families who had helped escapers and wanted to claim some compensation. Those files were all lodged in the British Embassy in Rome. They didn't have room for them. They wanted to send them back to London. London said, we don't want the damn things. What are we going to do with all this paper? And the Americans offered to take them. And for literally all the years since the war, until about 5 or 6 years ago, those files have lodged in a basement at the National Archive in Washington. We, as a trust, discovered the existence of this archive, and we realized that it would be an extraordinary record, because you see, there are lots of records of the escapers who benefited from the generosity of the Italians, but really the story is very little known in Italy, and there was really no way of Italian families finding out what their forefathers had done, unless, you know, the story had been passed down through the generations, or their families had there was a certificate issued called an Alexander certificate, signed by facsimile signature by General Alexander to say thank you. But these files are priceless because they contain full details of the families, details of what they did for escapers, and very often little original chits signed by the escapers expressing their gratitude to the family for whatever help and generous assistance they'd received. And all these files were lying in a basement in Washington. We have now done a deal. We've done a deal with the National Archive in the States. It's $250,000 worth to have this archive brought out of the basement and indexed and digitized. And the Americans have already started doing this. We've got a great relationship with them. And this extraordinary archive of documents will be just I think, the most exciting historical evidence of an extraordinary period of the World War II, when former enemies risked death to help Allied escapers. It's the most amazing story. Tragically, the other part of the work of the Allied Screening Commission was to recommend Italians for honours, a King's Medal for bravery. And although they nominated more than 400 Italian families for their work in helping escapers and for their bravery in doing that, it was decided by the War Cabinet that the British public wouldn't tolerate these medals being given to former enemies. And so although they were nominated, and those nominations were forwarded by the Allied Screening Commission to London, those families never received their medals. And I just think that's such a very sad end to an extraordinary tale of kindness to strangers.
Well, Nick, I mean, what a story and what a climate, and it lives on. And the work of the Monte San Martino Trust continues. So you are reaching out every year to young people in the areas where your father was. You want to come to England and learn English. Wonderful. You're doing this wonderful, unique archiving project, which will be available to everybody. So people in Italy can be able to go through grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and every generation afterwards to find out what their parents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents did and their family members did in this awful time. And I'm delighted to say that in addition to this, you're going to be speaking at our conference in Anzio, the Liberation of Rome conference.
I'm very much looking forward to that, Eddie. It'll be wonderful to be back in Anzio.
And I think this will be, we're having the conferences on 31st of May to the 1st of June. We're in Anzio. We have a very excellent group of speakers, including Sir Nick, and representatives from the Italian government and from at least eight of the nations involved in the liberation of Rome. So if you're going to be in the area at the time, anybody watching this, you can come and join us and hear Nick speak. But Nick's available. He's got a website. The Monte San Martino Trust is there. If you wish to support the trust, if you want to make to help the trust, I'm sure Nick would be most interested in hearing from you. And it would be great, would it not, Nick, if this apparent, well, let's call it an injustice with the use of the medal, maybe that could be rectified in some form.
That really would be wonderful. I mean, I think it's high time, frankly. And here we are, the 80th anniversary last year of this extraordinary escape, and 80th anniversary of the liberation of Italy next year. This would be a good time to, put right that. Well, injustice is perhaps a bit strong. I mean, you can kind of understand the war cabinet feeling as it did at the time, but it looks like a bit mean now when you consider that so many of us alive today would not have even been born if it had not been for the bravery of those Italian families who helped our fathers and grandfathers escape.
I can add nothing more to that, Nick. That's very much my sentiment. So look, again, just to remind people, get this book. I mean,
from Amazon or Pen and Sword, the publishers direct.
Really get this book if you want to get the goods with the most extraordinary story and continuing legacy. So Nick, thank you very much for your time. Congratulations on everything you're doing. I look forward to working with you and seeing you in due course, probably in the UK, but also in Anzio in about 3 months' time, less than that now.
I look forward to that too, Eddie, and thank you for keeping alive the story of the war in Italy. It's not as well known a story as some of the other theatres of war, and I think you're doing a great job just to keep it alive and to remind people what went on. It was a very tough war in Italy in many, many ways, and you're doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to take you off stage now, but don't go away. After the show is over, we can have a little bit of a chat. So that is it for this week in the Italian campaign. It's been a brilliant episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. We will be back next week with another episode when we'll be looking at the third battle for Cassino, dramatic moment involving the New Zealand Corps, of course, comprising the 2nd New Zealand Division and the 4th Indian Division. But that's next week. So until then, from everybody here at This Week in the Italian campaign, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.